you should give me $10 million. I'm going to find aliens. I'm like, oh God. I mean, you're really good, but find aliens? Like, what are we talking about here?
This week's focus was all about co-founders, stories from existing founders, and practical application of that. We covered modules 4 through 6. So in module 4, we took a deep dive into the advantages as well as the challenges of having one or more co-founders. In module 5, we featured iterative founders discussing their fears, the doubts they had before starting their startups, and how they overcame these obstacles and the lessons they learned along the way. In module 6, we provided an insider's look into the early stages of founding a startup. So Sukin shared what you might expect in the first day, the first week, the first month, and 3 months as the new founder. And it also included our startup readiness checklist, which is 5 practical steps to help you prepare. It's calculating your personal runway, it's setting goals and timelines, defining your idea, understanding your motivation, and validating your idea. What concerns you the most when you think about your first 3 months as a founder? So can I want to open this question to you as well? What were the first 3 months? What were they like? What were your concerns?
Gosh. I mean, the first 3 months, I said this last time, guys, but I was basically an idiot. So, what I'm about to say is kind of like, I don't think kind of like realistic, but I was just kind of like so excited to be working on a startup that I don't know if I had kind of much concerns. And by the way, we like sat in a basement and wrote code for the first 12 months. And so the first 3 months were just like, what do we call it? We call it the like, uh, you're in kind of like dreamland where you're just like waking up every day, you're like writing code and you think what the thing that you're building is going to be like the next Facebook, and like you just think it's awesome, and you like never talk to a user and never considered that this wasn't going to kind of like work. And so again, we were in just kind of like some fairy tale land. And so I think my uh, experience is kind of like quite different than, I mean, all of you who are taking this course are already kind of like better off than I was, because you guys are actually kind of like thinking about it and like working on kind of like how to kind of like do this. And we were just kind of like idiots, basically. Don't be like Sukan.
Yeah, it was very similar. I mean, there was no framework, there was no prep, there was just diving into it, which in retrospect was a big mistake because you got to just figure out so many more things than you already have to. But yeah, it was chaos. Like it was sort of that lack of structure in a way of like, wait, where do I begin? What do I do? How do I start? Is it the right thing? So tons of questions.
We didn't. We just coded. Like literally, we just spent all of our time coding, which is the wrong thing to do. But we just spent all of our time coding.
That I won't know what to expect. Let me just scroll, and therefore won't know how it's hidden in my screen for some reason. But okay, how to prepare. I think this is a big thing, and maybe I want to deep dive into this. What to expect and don't know how to prepare. Is there a way to alleviate that in your first month? Like just kind of don't know where to start.
Um, I mean, I guess there's like so much kind of like nuance with this, right? I mean, I think if you're going to kind of start a startup, if you have an idea, I mean, you want to spend all of your time kind of validating that idea. And so that's the only thing you like, that's honestly the only thing you should kind of like worry about. Don't worry about talking to investors, including me, by the way. Like, don't worry about talking to investors. Honestly, don't worry about incorporation. Anything that has to do with a lawyer is basically kind of like a waste of time at this. Like, you kind of just don't have to kind of like worry about a lot of these things. And so the primary thing is like trying to figure out if people want what you're making, which I think we shared a link last time on kind of like content around that. But like you should just spend all of your time basically doing the things that we talk about there. And so, I think that's where you should spend all of your energy, basically.
Yep. I'm looking at a couple of the other ones. Designing the right startup idea. Well, that's something I think hopefully
Yeah.
this module helped you out. How to hunt down my customer, hunt down my customer. I kind of like the choice of words. How do you find customers in the early days? Is there a best way to find your
I
customers?
mean, I think again, I think if you this the validation stuff will go into kind of like very like great detail about this, but I mean the typical thing is basically if you're a B2B company, you kind of hunt through them kind of like through direct outreach on like LinkedIn and email and all this kind of stuff. And if you're doing consumer stuff, then you spend a little bit of money, and by little bit, guys, I mean like you can spend like $20 a week, and kind of like try to see if people want to sign up for what you're kind of like building and stuff. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think a lot of these kind of responses is I I actually think it's scarier before you start, if that helps anybody. Because I feel like before you start, you're just thinking a lot about what could go wrong. and but you're like not engaging with it yet. And so the worst thing is to kind of like have the fears but not be able to do anything about them. And so I think you actually will feel better once you have started and you're like actively kind of like working on things. Then I think you actually kind of like end up feeling better. But um I think the like leading up to it is actually kind of like more worrisome.
I think that kind of also links to one more person who said, even with the experience in the field, there's still so much that I don't know that keeps popping up. I just feel like that's going to be a constant. Not only in the first 3 months, it's going to
Yeah.
be in 6 months, 12 months. It'll be throughout. And so is there a way to like tackle that or have a methodology to just be like, okay, this is how I'm going to figure it out?
No, and like, and guys, let's see, I'm 41. I started the first company when I was 22, so I've been doing this for a long time, and I consistently feel like I don't know what I'm doing. Like even now, all the time, I'm like, oh gosh, I don't know. Like, what should we kind of like do here? The thing that the trick ends up being that there's two things. One, I think you just get comfortable and accept the fact that you are going to consistently be in situations where you don't know what you're doing. Like, I think the sooner you can kind of like accept that, I think kind of like you're in kind of like better shape. That's not easy to do. I'm not suggesting this is like, oh, just like accept it and then move on with your life. It's hard. But I think there is a part of this where it's kind of like if you want to run a marathon and you're like, oh man, but what happens if I get tired? It's like, I mean, you're gonna get tired running a marathon. Like you just have to accept you're gonna get tired. There's nobody who runs a marathon that doesn't get tired, right? So you just gotta accept that like that's the case and it is normal and that's how it is. And everybody who runs marathons gets tired. Every startup founder feels like they don't know what they're doing. All of them. I don't care what you hear on YouTube videos and all that stuff. I've had conversations with all of those people. They don't know what they're doing, including me. And then the second part I think is, and this is kind of June and Pranav know this well because I talk about it with my team quite a lot. You want to learn the meta skill of getting good at at learning things. And so I think sometimes, and that is actually a skill. Like some people are better at learning things than others. And I don't think it's kind of an innate thing or whatever. I think this is like a thing that you can learn how to do. And I think if you can build that skill, then you're going to be in kind of really good shape. And, I don't want to do a whole kind of like lecture on how to kind of get good at being good at things, but there's kind of like they all follow like typical kind of like frameworks around like, you know, see what other people do, kind of do the research, deliberate practice, like all of this kind of stuff. And so you just treat it kind of like anything else, and you just kind of like work at it. But yeah, you always kind of feel this in some way. I guess maybe the idea that I don't know what I'm doing is no longer uncomfortable to me. I still have it, but it's just not uncomfortable anymore.
And I
It's
think it's
just
good
my
to have the
friend.
concern.
Just my
It's
friend.
because it will happen. So it's good to have that concern beforehand, right? Like it's good
Yeah.
to be aware that this will happen.
Oh,
So
totally,
yeah,
totally, totally good to be aware.
yeah. Do I need to think about the business model when I start validating my idea?
I think I mean, uh, should you think about it? Sure, you should kind of like think about it. Do you have to have it figured out? Absolutely not. And in fact, if you told me you figured out the business model before you validated it, I would be like, that's bullshit. You definitely don't. Business models change consistently all the time, right? The idea of a business model is kind of like a fluid concept, I think, among startups. And so it changes all the time. It is, and business model, features, target customers, all of these kinds of things. Things are quite fluid for startups. And so I think it's good to have a hypothesis on what you think it's going to be, because if you have a hypothesis, it's easier to test. And so then it's easier to validate. But I would be kind of like open-minded that your hypothesis may be wrong. One of the things that I talk about at orientation is to kind of like treat startups like a scientist would. And scientists have an hypothesis about what's going to happen, but they're very open-minded about running experiments and not like their hypothesis being wrong. And you kind of want to have a similar kind of like take here. If it's a consumer thing, you kind of don't need to though. Like if you're making like when the Instagram people made Instagram, they definitely didn't worry about business model. So less of a thing on the consumer side. B2B kind of.
The next question is the CEO always responsible for the cohesion of the founding team? I guess maybe I want to go a layer above and ask, how should the initial founders even take on responsibilities? How should you split responsibilities? And what does that mean? What does it mean
This
to
is
be the
such a
CEO?
good question. And by the way, whoever asked this question, I think this is such a like good question. And it shows like you've really kind of like dug into this. To me, the first thing I think about when I read this is we always talk about that there are founders and co-founders. And what we mean by that is out of every co-founding team, there's typically one person who kind of got everybody else into this, like, as we joke, into this mess, right? And so if I'm the like founder, I'm like going to Pranav and I'm like, hey, Pranav, you should like join me and do this thing. It's going to be great. And I'm like, June, you should join me and do this thing. It's going to be great. And maybe they are like, I don't know, stupid enough to join me on do this thing. And so now we are co-founders. But in that kind of part, Pranav and June are co-founders, and I'm kind of like the founder because I brought it together. That doesn't mean that I own more of the company or anything like that. We would split it all equal. Like that doesn't mean anything, but there always is kind of one person who's kind of like the agitator, right? That person typically ends up being the CEO, but is not always the CEO. There's no hard rules around any of this, but like oftentimes that ends up being the case. And then I do think that as the CEO, it's often kind of their responsibility to kind of like keep the team together and kind of like my second company was Brian and I in LP Zone. So we had three kind of co-founders. And so it was good because then it was one of us, there would always be two people who disagreed. And then the third person was always kind of like adjudicate. And so it doesn't always have to be the CEO, but I think if it really becomes a problem and somebody has to step up and nobody is stepping up, then I think it's part of the CEO's responsibility to kind of like step up and kind of do something. I think it's their kind of like responsibility. The other thing that we talked about too was, at least amongst us, is the CEO tends to have kind of like a trump card. And so when it comes to kind of like, hey, we're going to go in this new direction. I mean, we all talk about it or whatever, but the CEO kind of like has a little bit more kind of like power to kind of break deadlocks. But for whoever's asking this, it typically is kind of the CEO. But again, amongst co-founders, you guys can figure out whatever works the best for you. But you want to kind of make sure that there's somebody to point to who's kind of responsible for something like this. And traditionally, it's the CEO.
So the question is, should I raise capital after my idea is validated and I have a steady customer base, even though I can serve a few of them, only a few of them, I'm guessing, due to limited manpower?
I mean, I think the question I would ask is, why do you need to raise capital kind of like at all, right? And so if you do need to raise capital so that you can kind of work on this full time and all of that, then I would definitely, I would ask that question first. The second part is, I think you should raise capital kind of after you kind of validate and have some kind of like customer base. If you can validate and get to a customer base without raising capital, I think that's almost like always better than kind of raising capital then validating and stuff, purely because if you raise capital, it's much harder to raise money without having a validation and kind of like some customer base. And if you do, you're going to do it at a lower valuation. So to me, I'm like, it's always better to kind of like have it this way. But there's scenarios where I think it's like it's hard to kind of get the steady customer base, but you can always validate to some extent, I think, before you raise capital. I wouldn't worry too much about serve a few of them due to limited. I wouldn't worry about that at all. That's not that big of a problem. Like every founder would gladly be in a situation where they have more customers than they can serve. That's the easiest problem to solve, like the easiest. So I wouldn't worry about that one too much. Very solvable. Money, technology, kind of like just more people.
Ooh, this is interesting. All right. So between an exceptionally intelligent founder or a patient and persistent founder, which founder would investors prefer to work with?
I mean, I would love to work with an exceptionally intelligent, patient, and persistent founder. That's basically like the unicorn perfection. I think it depends, right? So different investors have different preferences. So there are some investors who I think weigh intelligence over kind of everything. And then I think there are some investors that weigh kind of persistence and grit over kind of like intelligence, right? So it kind of depends on the investor. If you're asking me, I think the thing that I would probably do is it kind of like, sorry guys, I don't have like it always is kind of nuanced. If you told me it's an exceptionally intelligent founder, but they're kind of assholes, I'm not investing. I don't care about anything else. I'm just not going to do it. And by the way, that happens to us. I wouldn't say it happens to us all the time, but like it happens to us, enough times where it's like, this is like a thing at Iterative, right? So I wouldn't do that. If you ask me, hey, would you invest in a patient and persistent founder who was like, I don't know what's a nice way to say it, but the exact opposite of an exceptionally intelligent founder, then that one's going to be a little bit tricky too. I don't think that the successful founders necessarily are the most intelligent. Like being a startup founder is not an intelligence test. I have some of my smartest friends who tried to be a founder are not successful, and some of my like kind of okay smart friends have been kind of very successful. So I think there, to me, it's like you need to be smart enough to kind of like do the job, but you'd be surprised. That's not, that doesn't mean you have to like have a PhD or even have gone to college. That's not what we mean by like smart enough, right? So I don't think you need any of those things. You do need to be patient and kind of like persistent, because if you are not patient or persistent, you will quit. So it kind of doesn't matter how smart you are if you just quit, right? So there's, I think for most investors, there's some triangulation of this, of like, can this person figure out how to do this, which is some form of kind of intelligence, and will they quit before they get there, which is kind of the persistence part. And what you need is, I think this person can figure it out, and I think they will figure it out before they quit. And that's basically kind of like the game.
I think it's also kind of similar to asking the question of, would you rather have a co-founder that's one or the other? I think that's
Co-founder.
no, what I'm saying is the same thing can be extrapolated to even when you're looking for
Yeah.
co-founders, right? Because
Yeah, no, true.
would you want one or the other? And I think it's kind of similar to what the investor wants, because whatever's going to have a higher chance of success, I guess.
It is, but I think it's different, because I think when it's a co-founder, I think okay, first of all, I would kind of think about like, am I very patient and persistent, or am I exceptionally intelligent? Like, which one am I? Because if like I'm exceptionally intelligent, I kind of need somebody who's going to be patient. And if I'm patient, and I'm patient but kind of dumb, I kind of need somebody who's kind of like smart. But with co-founders, I think it's a different thing, because it's mainly values, I think, is what it comes down to. The one thing that I will say though is, um, I think as co-founders, the one thing I don't want to spend a lot of time doing with my co-founder is continually trying to motivate them and convince them not to quit. Like, that's an employee, not a co-founder. Right. And so to me, I'm kind of like, I don't want to be doing that all the time. We can have debates about what's the smart thing to do. I think that's like an appropriate thing to kind of co-founders. But like, if Pranav has to like have a like heart to heart with me every week because I want to quit, like, oh, we're screwed. We're like so screwed. Right. Like, Pranav is going to get tired at some point, and Pranav needs somebody in the like trenches with him who's like, all right, like let's like do this. So
All right. So the next question is, it's an interesting topic, I think. So
yeah,
I
yeah.
heard, so he says, I heard
Yeah.
ESOPs are not common or as generous in Southeast Asia. Is that true?
Absolutely true. 100% true. But guys, I think it's surprisingly not because of the startups, it's because people don't value it. People in Southeast Asia don't value ESOPs as much as they do in San Francisco. People in Southeast Asia value, and look, there's good reasons for this. I'm not saying it's dumb and all that. There's very good reasons for this, and I understand kind of like that kind of stuff. But practically, this is very true. The reason why they don't is because there's been less liquidity events in Southeast Asia, and so less people have made money off of ESOP in Southeast Asia. In San Francisco, like, so many people are running around who like made so much money off of ESOP that like people, it's like if June and Pranav were my friends, you guys are not my friends, but you know, if we were like actually friends, and June made a bunch of money on ESOP and Pranav made a bunch of money on ESOP and I haven't made money on ESOP, I'm gonna go work at a startup and I'm like, I'm gonna want ESOP. If Pranav has made no money in ESOP and tells me a story about how he worked at Grab and then they IPO'd and then he made no money at Grab, and then June tells me the same story at this startup and she made no money in ESOPs, I'm gonna go talk to a startup and I'm like, I don't want ESOP, right? So I think people don't value it as much, and then people kind of then value kind of salaries as more. As a result, Southeast Asia startups aren't as kind of generous with ESOP because they don't think it like really motivates people. But founders here care about it a lot. So to me, I'm kind of like, if I'm a founder and I care about equity a lot and I don't want to give up more of my equity and people don't value it very much, then like I don't need to give very much. I'm just going to try to like pay people. This also is, I think, bad for the ecosystem because then it's kind of very difficult to attract top talent when people don't value ESOP. Like the primary reason in SF, the way that you get top talent is basically ESOP, right? I'm not going to outpay Google. No way. Right. If you want more salary, go work at Google for sure. I'm not, I won't waste your time. But I think this is like a tricky kind of like thing here, but it's true. Absolutely true.
Do you think employees in Southeast Asia should value ESOPs then, in your opinion? So I guess this is a follow-up to the previous one.
Okay, I think this depends on your situation and what you're looking for. Okay, if you come from a financial background that is maybe kind of like less stable, let's say, then I think you have to get. Then I think people are rightfully kind of like optimizing for some level of stability, right? And so, look, if you are like you're not saving any money at the end of the month and you're kind of making it kind of month to month and stuff. Yeah, I don't know. ESOPs is like very risky and I don't know if it's going to help you kind of very much and kind of like stress. And so salary makes sense there, right? If you come from a more stable kind of background, then I think you should kind of take a shot at it, right? And I think, part of this is also kind of like, what are you looking for? You're never going to make a couple $1 million on salary. It's never going to happen, guys. Won't happen. So if you really care, this is your guy. This is everybody owns choice. If you really want to be worth like a couple $1 million, you're not going to salary your way into a couple $1 million, right? You can definitely make a couple $1 million on ESOP, but it is very high risk. And you probably won't, right? And so do you trade something that is likely it's something that's likely to happen with a low ceiling. So, making a salary is kind of like, I mean, it's guaranteed and you have kind of, but you won't make that much. Or do you want something that is higher risk, but kind of like a high ceiling? And, that's kind of up to, the individuals kind of like, the individuals are kind of like your situation and kind of like what you want and that kind of stuff. This is also why the case, I think in SF, especially with people who are young, they all kind of roll the dice, right? They're like, I'm gonna spend all my 20s and early 30s rolling the dice on ESOP, and if I don't hit a winner on kind of that, then it's kind of like okay, and then they can. This is a weird saying, but this is what people say. They retire into Google, which is they play the casino machine in SF, and then they retire and get a job at Google, and like it's all good. So I don't know. This one's kind of like hard to do it. I would like to see people value ESOP more. Because I think it's good for the startup ecosystem. And if we can get this place to go, then, I think more people will benefit from the success of the startup ecosystem if they have kind of ESOP. But it's like a chicken and egg. Like if we can get more people to make money through ESOP, then more people will take it. But until we can't, then it won't. And so, it's a little bit chicken and egg.
All right.
Ooh.
Interesting. What are co-founder red flags to look out for?
The number one thing I thought of was ego. If your co-founder has like big ego, I think that is kind of like going to be very worrisome. And the reason why that ends up happening is if they have a big ego, it's likely they're going to prioritize themselves over you and over the company. And I think that's going to be kind of like very challenging to kind of like deal with. Also, if you get any level of success, the ego monster just grows. I think I like to say that like money doesn't change you, money just makes you more of who you are. And so if somebody's quite egotistical and then you get some level of success and they start being on magazines and stuff, then they're going to spend all of their time trying to be on magazines and stuff instead of like kind of like actually getting to work. And so I think ego is kind of like a really big kind of like red flag for me. So that's one piece. Two, I would try to get some measure of kind of resilience. Like, have they ever kind of done anything in their life that was like kind of like difficult and kind of like persevere? Do they have any evidence of kind of like resilience? Or you can look at their motivations. Are they internally motivated or externally motivated? Again, if you want to be on magazine covers, that's external motivation. Internal motivation is like, I really care about this problem. I learn a lot from startups. And so all of like the reason you're doing it kind of comes from inside. They tend to be a little bit more resilient. Oh, I mean, small. I don't know if they're like as big of red flags as this, but I probably wouldn't start a company with anybody says, "Oh, I don't do X." Like I wouldn't start a company with somebody who was like, "I've never done sales." He's like, "Oh yeah, I don't do sales." "Oh, I'm not a technical person. I won't take out the garbage." Like, nah. Founders like you do whatever you need at the moment that you need to do it. It doesn't matter if you're good or bad. Like none of that matters. It's just that like if Pranav, June, and I started a company and we were like, oh man, we really need to like do this sales thing. And between the three of us, we were like, Scan, I think you got the best shot at it. I'm like, cool. I just bought 3 sales books. I'm going to read them this weekend. And Monday, I'm like getting on sales calls. Screw it. Like, let's go. Right. Like, and so anybody who's like, I won't do that. I don't do this and like that kind of stuff. And by the way, that also tends to be tied with ego. So you know, that's another piece. Any other red flags that people have that they want to kind of throw in? I'm sure I mean, there's a lot more, I'm sure, but ego is the one that kind of jumped out at me the most. Similar life stage.
Life
Oh,
stage.
okay. Talk to me about this. You think this is why? Yeah.
It's just when you have kids and you have a family and you're looking out for more than one person, right? You're not just looking for yourself, you're looking out for other people as well.
Yeah.
And you have, say, 20-year-olds who are hungry and willing to work 24/7, and then you have someone who has to go home at 6 because wife and kids. So that sort of life stage is what I'm talking about.
That definitely I don't know if I would rule it out, but it definitely makes it tough, right? Because I think co-founders you're going to need to feel like you're both equally invested. And look, somebody with a family is like, their startup is not more important than their family. So it's kind of hard to kind of ask them to kind of like do that. And so I definitely think this one kind of like makes it tricky for people.
Yeah.
Ben, talk to me. Red flag? I mean, not ideal for sure, but you think red flag?
Yeah, I mean, more to not ideal. Yeah, if the skill sets are literally like if a marketer meets another marketer, I think maybe at least at the founding stage, it makes no real sense for that.
I would, and Ben, I would, I mean, I can kind of understand that. The other thing I would kind of potentially argue too is that like, I think skill sets tend to be kind of like overrated a little bit. It's like, yeah, it's definitely not ideal if you guys both have the kind of the same one, but chances are you're both going to have to learn a lot of skill sets. And so, I mean, I wouldn't put this as a red flag. And I think that's what you're saying. You're like, hey, not ideal, but but I've never heard 2 people complain about having 2 technical co-founders. Just joking. I mean, that's true, but co-founding is a thing. Engineers are kind of like always wanted apparently.
All
Oh,
right,
interesting.
let's move on. How would you reply to an early stage investor regarding valuation at such an early stage, either priced or safe note? Yeah.
Well, I mean, the thing that we always kind of try to tell people, we always try to tell our companies, and there's founders the investors will push back in the other way, is kind of like the thing we always kind of tell our companies is you want to be focused around some milestone. So we always tell our companies when you're fundraising that I'm raising X amount of dollars to reach X amount of ARR, MRR, whatever. So some milestone. I'm like, Pranav, if Pranav is an investor, I'm raising $1 million to reach $4 million in ARR. That's why I'm raising. That's what I want to do. And if Pranav is like, okay, like what valuation and that kind of stuff, you're like, oh, you'd be like, hey, Pranav, I'm primarily concerned with kind of like, I need $1 million because I think that will get me to kind of 4 million. What do you think is kind of like a fair kind of valuation? And this is just like normal, like, okay, can you get them to kind of say a number first? If they really push and all of that kind of stuff, then okay, maybe, I'll kind of like try to kind of pick a number. But look, if it's like super early stage, you're kind of just picking numbers out of a hat. Like maybe this is kind of helpful to people. There are no formulas with valuation, especially at the early stage. Your valuation is whatever you can get somebody to pay. Like there's no secret formula that VCs like just don't want to tell you. There is none. Like we do these kinds of deals all the time, and it's basically like how much can you get an investor to like what valuation can you get an investor, right? And so if Pranav is like 100 million, I'm like, I like you, Pranav. Nope, I won't do that, right? Pranav is like, $1 million. I'm like, oh, okay, maybe, you know what I mean? And so, I'm like, Pranav, you probably like short sold yourself, right? And so, you can kind of have the debate. The way that you kind of help educate yourself on kind of roughly what it is you just, you can Google kind of like, what is the average kind of like valuation for a pre-seed company in 2023? I mean, you can kind of ballpark plus or minus and all that kind of stuff, but at least gives you in the ballpark. But I wouldn't worry too much about this. But yeah, you could just say, hey, look, I'm raising this much to get to this, I'm less concerned with valuation. What do you think is kind of a fair valuation? And by the way, whatever they say, you can still say a little bit higher. Like if Pranav is like, oh, I think a fair valuation is 2. And you're like, okay, I appreciate that. I was thinking kind of like more 3. How would you feel about 3? And they're like, oh, it's higher than obviously kind of like 2. And, we can kind of like have that conversation. But but by the way, it's a discussion. Valuations are conversations and negotiations.
How should a founder wannabe take the leap from full-time job to entrepreneurship, especially with various responsibilities?
I mean, I think you again, I think you validate. And so I think if you have an idea, I mean, I think June kind of put the link to kind of validation, but I would spend my time kind of validating in my free time while I kind of have the full-time job, which is basically kind of nights and weekends. Doesn't have to be every night or anything like that, but like nights and weekends kind of stuff. And then you are building evidence to suggest that like, making the leap is a good idea. The short form of this is like, I could I could quit my job now to start a like space heater company in Singapore. But like the thing I should probably do is like, can I sell any space heaters in Singapore before I quit my job? And which I probably can't. Nobody wants heat in Singapore. But if I could sell like even 20 space heaters in Singapore without quitting my job, that's some evidence that like, okay, I'm more likely to quit my job after selling 20 space heaters than I was kind of like before I sold zero, right? So you can take this kind of like a bit at a time, validating. Founder wannabe, we like to call them future founders to be nice.
What do you think of this co-founder combo as an
Yeah.
example? Both invest in the company, one crazily
Yeah.
risk-loving and one very grounded.
I mean, it just sounds like Brian and I. And June and Pranav immediately laugh because they know what I'm talking about. Like, I'm the very grounded one, guys. Like, Pranav, June, agree? Like, is it quite noticeable?
Yeah.
We joke internally at Iterative that Brian is like a golden retriever. He's like super happy to see everybody, and is like, oh my god, we can do this, and we can do this, and like everything's exciting. And then you talk to Suken, and I'm always like, okay, but have you thought about this? Okay, what are we gonna do about this? Okay, how does this work? And like, it works as a team as long as those two people can kind of like learn how to work together. If Brian thought I was always just kind of like putting down his ideas, then it wouldn't work. And then if I thought that Brian was like just being dumb thinking of ideas and kind of like not actually how we would do it, and then that would also kind of like not work. But we have kind of like a good mix where it's like he can come up with good ideas and he uses me as a filter, and he'll throw like 10 ideas at me and be like, okay, which one actually makes sense? And I'll be like, okay, these 3 are stupid. This one's kind of interesting, but like you shouldn't do it this way. You should do it this other way and all this kind of stuff. And so we kind of do this way. Yes. And Brian loves meeting people, and I avoid people like the plague. So that's also good. So Brian actually will go out into the world and talk to like a bunch of people, and he'll come back super excited and be like, okay, so this is happening, and then this, and he's like feeding it into my brain. And then my brain is like, we should do this. That's what happens all the time.
I'm also curious to hear if any of you guys think there's a combo that doesn't work in your opinion. I'm curious to see what you guys. I like the example of 2 types of co-founders.
I mean, if 2 people are only risk loving, they probably just like try to do crazy stuff and never kind of get anywhere because none of them can like plan. And if you're like 2 very grounded people, you probably can like execute super well, but like you don't do anything that ambitious, right? And so you're kind of like, you just don't get that far.
All right. So next question is: are there some MRR figures or growth metrics that help determine readiness for investment?
Not really. There's no magic kind of like numbers here, guys. We've invested in companies with 0 MR. I've not invested in companies with like tens of thousands of MR. And so there's no kind of like set rules here. It kind of depends on what they're working on and all of that kind of stuff. I think if you're doing kind of like a couple thousand MR, that's not bad. Especially if you're kind of like, pre-seed, maybe haven't taken money and that kind of stuff. That's like, that's like a pretty kind of like decent kind of like thing. But the thing that people really look at is rate of growth. And so rather, if Pranav was like, I'm making 10,000 MR, I'm like, oh, nice. I'm like, okay, how fast are you growing? He's like, oh, I've been at 10,000 MR for the past 5 years. I'm like, oh, not investing in your company, right? If June was like, I have 1,000 MR, and I'm like, okay, cool. How long have you been doing it? She's like 5 days ago. I'm like, oh shit, like June, where do I send the money, right? So I think the rate at which something is kind of growing is actually more important than the actual kind of amount.
Is there a growth metric that's good? Because I think one of those things is also how fast is fast growth. What is
like speed, like growth speed?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, during the batch, we always say 5 to 7% weekly growth, right? Is the thing that we're always kind of like shooting for, and so and that's non-cumulative, guys. So every week can you grow 5 to 7% more than you did the previous week? non-cumulative. And that's basically the goal for the batch, is for us to try to help you do that. If you can do that consistently, please email me because I would like to give you money. It's not such an easy thing to kind of like do. And by the way, you can do it quite quickly when you're first starting out. Like if you have one user, it's pretty easy to get to like 2 users and 3 users, or whatever. It gets very hard when you're at large numbers. And so, if you're making $1 million a week, it's quite hard to make like 1,070,000 the next week. So.
Oh, interesting. Is there an age preference for co-founders in the eyes of an investor, say somebody in the 40s or 50s?
Not really. I think it depends on kind of maybe the type of company that you're working on. If I don't want to be ageist, but if you were working on this like the next Snapchat for high school kids or secondary school kids, and you're in your 50s, I would be like, huh, really? You like, it just seems kind of odd because like I don't know how well they would know about kind of like what high school, like what kids kind of like in this generation want and all that kind of stuff. I think older founders tend to work on a lot more B2B ideas, and then I think younger founders tend to work on more consumer ones. But as far as kind of investors go, I think if you are working on a B2B idea, older is kind of like often kind of like helpful and kind of like good, and then kind of for consumer and kind of like it's kind of all over the map. It depends. I mean, if you're making Snapchat, okay, maybe people want kind of younger, but if you're making like Google, like then it doesn't really matter. So no strong age preference, people.
So next one is about pivoting. So what are the signs that you should start pivoting your idea? Would challenges in user acquisition be one of those signs?
100%. It is the like primary sign. So I think the thing that we always kind of try to do is a startup should be growing. And so if you are not growing, then something is wrong. And by the way, most startups, especially when they start, are not growing. And so it doesn't mean that like I tried this for a week and I'm not growing, so I should quit. That's not what I'm saying. But if you haven't grown for kind of like a reasonable period of time over kind of like months, then I think you got to start asking yourself why. And if the answer is like, oh, maybe I need to try this and I need to try that and I need you to do this, then try those things. If you've exhausted those things and you're like still haven't grown and you don't have any other ideas for like how to move forward, then I think it's time to kind of start thinking about kind of like, okay, maybe this idea doesn't work and I should work on a new idea. Obviously, if you're working on an idea and you run out of ideas, continuing to do what you're doing and hoping for kind of a different result doesn't make any sense, right? So I think that's typically how I would think about kind of like pivoting. When you start kind of like an idea, just assume you're going to work on it for kind of first 3 to kind of like 6 months and just bank that in and being like, okay, I'm going to work on this. Try to get it to grow as much as you can. And then if you get really stuck and you run out of ideas, that's probably when you want to kind of start thinking about maybe your idea doesn't work. Like maybe people just don't want it.
The company only has 2 founders. How do you resolve conflicts and make the final decision on a certain issue?
I mean, Brian and I have only 2 founders at Iterative. So how do we resolve conflicts? Our basic rule is it depends on where the decision sits. So Pranav and June know this well. I run the recruiting team and the founder teams at Iterative. So if there's a decision about the batch and how the batch is going to run, that is my decision to make. If there's a decision to make about something with the investments team or fundraising, that is Brian's decision to make. Now, we've always had this agreement, which is if he feels strongly about something that is in my kind of area of responsibility, I need to do the responsible thing, which is listen to him and understand where he's coming from and all of that kind of stuff. That doesn't mean I need to do what he says, but it is kind of part of my responsibility to kind of like listen, right? And engage and try to understand where he's coming from. And that tends to work kind of like pretty well for the both of us. So I think you have to kind of figure out, who has final say in what areas, and you need to do this before the conflict comes up. If you're trying to decide this while the conflict is going in, you will never get there. So you need to kind of just figure this out beforehand. It also helps your team a lot because then your team knows who to kind of go to and like who makes decisions on what. Like, I mean, June, it would be like crazy if you're like, do I need to run this by Sukan or Brian? And it's like changes like between projects. I mean, it would just be like terrible, right? And then she's going to be on some email thread where Brian and I are like disagreeing on something, and she's like, "What do I do now?" Right? And look, you guys have been on email threads where Brian and I disagree about stuff, but you know who's at the end of the day going to kind of like who gets to kind of like make the call. So helps your team too.
I think it's a common mistake that people fall into, which is not sort of demarcating that, and then there's a lot of time wasted in.
Yeah, it's one of those it's like a relationship thing where you're like, oh, we'll worry about this when this happens, or it'll be fine, or whatever, and then when it happens, it's just like it's so punishing and kind of like bad for everybody. Please do this ahead of time. I mean, I always think about it as roles and responsibilities. If you're gonna have co-founding, if you're gonna have a co-founder, you need to have a roles and responsibilities question, which is just like, what are you working on? What am I working on? What am I responsible for? What are you responsible for? You can update those as you kind of like go along, but there needs to be like a standing, like, agreement on kind of what those are.
Somebody said, I'm stuck narrowing ideas down. So far, the problems of physicals, pet food. I want to do tech instead. Are tech startups critical to be VC friendly?
Why do you want to do tech? Like, I mean, why not start a pet food physical kind of like business? I mean, that could be a reasonable business. And so I think my first question is kind of like, why do you want to do something that is digital? Assuming that you really do want to do something that's digital, I think the thing you want to think about is venture capitalists want to invest in something that can get very large in about 5 to 7 years, because that is how long our fund life cycle is. And so every time I raise a fund, I have 5 to 7 years to return money to my investors, which means I need to invest in companies kind of quickly, and they need to be able to return me money. Most of the investments, like 97%, 95%, are going to lose money, which means that the ones that do work need to return me a lot of money. There's only certain types of companies that are able to kind of like return a lot of money in 5 to 7 years, and they tend to be more digitally focused. This is the reason why there wasn't a huge venture capital market like 500 years ago, because if you were like, I don't know, let's say you're like opening pet food stores across kind of like Southeast Asia, the time it would take for you to open your first store and then to open your 100th store is like really long, because every time you open a store, you have to like find a location, and you need to like rent space, and you need to hire people, and you need to stock it, and all of that kind of stuff. And so, but Facebook, when it went from like 1 million to 100 million users, like turned on a couple servers, right? I mean, they could do that in a week. Right. And so I think that's why kind of like VCs tend to think about more digital businesses, because they have that kind of like growth trajectory, or businesses that are able to have that. But there are some VCs that do D2C, and I think kind of like physical. So, that's starting to kind of branch out. But I think traditional kind of VCs, tech VCs need this piece.
Do you recommend incorporating as Delaware C Corp or in Singapore?
I mean, Singapore. If you're in Singapore, do Singapore. I don't know. I don't know why you would kind of like do Delaware. We have all of our companies do Singapore. All the VCs in Southeast Asia are very comfortable investing in Singapore. That is the primary place they invest in. Even kind of American investors are mostly comfortable with kind of Singapore. This is public, but I don't think most people know. YC will only invest in 3 jurisdictions. YC will invest in US, Singapore, Caymans. That's the list. So, Singapore is a good jurisdiction.
All right. Are remote founders from different countries more or less favorable for investors to work with? Is this common in your experience? I think maybe it's about not being in person in the same location. Like, is there a difference in preference if the 2 founders are located in different countries?
I mean, I think investors have their own kind of preferences on these kinds of things. I think the trick is that I think it's advantageous for founders who are just working together for the first time and working on very early stage companies to kind of be in the same place, because I think you need to build that relationship. There's a lot of kind of back and forth, and sometimes you kind of like, I think it's good to kind of have that. We don't personally have a rule that says, hey, co-founders have to be in the same country. And that's actually kind of never even come up in conversation. So it's not something that we have prejudice against. But I think for, if I was doing a startup for the first time, I would probably want to be in the same place with my co-founder, at least for like maybe the first 6 months or something like that, right? You want to get to know each other and kind of all that stuff. Brian and I started Iterative remotely, kind of like this, but we'd also worked together for like 15 years. So it's kind of like fine.
Okay, so next question is, how should a solo tech founder validate any idea? Or perhaps even earlier, where there's no idea, but the future founder would like to get into a certain industry. So I was going to say, I think we should attack the first question first, which is, how should a solo technical founder validate an idea?
Yeah, the same way as kind of anyone. I don't think validation changes if you're kind of like one founder, two founder, non-tech, tech, whatever. Like it's kind of all the same. So I don't think there's any kind of like difference there. The second question, no idea, get into a certain industry. I guess the thing I would try to understand is like, why do you want to get into the industry? Are you like looking? I guess the idea is that you're hunting for ideas. And so if that's the case, then I think if you are like, sorry, in order to validate an idea, you obviously need to have an idea. So if you don't have an idea, then I think kind of like you can definitely kind of hunt in specific industries. And easy ways to do this is just like find anybody who's in that industry and just like talk to them about what they do and any problems that they run into, ask them to introduce other people in the industry, and just like start just working kind of the network, and just buy people coffee and talk to them about kind of what they're doing. When I was working on the on-demand blue collar staffing platforms, basically the way I stumbled onto that is um, I messaged all of my friends in Singapore, which were not very many at that time, who did not work in tech. And I was like, I want to have coffee. And it was funny because I had friends who worked in tech. They're like, I want to have coffee. And I'm like, yeah, I don't want to talk to you. You have to work in an industry outside of tech. I know enough about tech. I don't need to talk to any more tech people, right? So I talked to people in F&B. I talked to people in kind of logistics. I talked to people in like farming and like, and all my conversations were just me trying to learn about how their business works, where do they kind of struggle, like that kind of stuff. And I'm just looking for ways to like, hey, if you could like hire me to write software for you, like, what would you want me to do? And, we would talk about that stuff.
If I can ask a follow-up on the second part, because I think I made a little bit more sense of that. So if I'm a technical founder and I want to get into an industry that I don't have experience in, do I need a co-founder who's from the industry?
Nah. I mean, everybody wants engineers, right? I mean, it's like, if you want to like get an F&B and you're an engineer, I would just like go talk to F&B people and be like, I'll make software for you. What do you want? I mean, nobody's saying no to that. Do you know what I mean? Like you're gonna just make free software for my like one restaurant? Like, okay, And so no, not necessary at all. You could just go talk to people. I actually think sometimes taking somebody who's outside the industry and then going to learn about the industry sometimes yields kind of like is very productive, because since you're a dummy with the industry, you kind of ask dummy questions, and then sometimes the dummy questions are like very insightful and you just don't know it. Or you have just a different way to kind of like think about stuff. And sometimes people who are from that industry are kind of like entrenched in that industry, and so they think like everybody else in the industry, right? And you're, as a startup, you're like almost by definition trying to do something new in that industry.
When pitching in the early stages, should I focus on the long-term vision for my startup or just the immediate goals for the next couple of years?
I laughed because for all people who are founders, a couple of years is the long-term vision. Like a couple of years is basically an eternity, I think, to kind of like founders. I think it's kind of like more that. It depends on how you answer this question too. I mean, yes, you want to paint a picture of kind of like, hey, how is the world different if my startup is successful? But if you spend all of your time talking about that, like the thing I hate the most is when founders are like, okay, so when everybody is using our product, we can do this. And I'm like, I mean, yeah, that's true. But the game is, how do you get everybody to use your product? And so that's the thing you really need to kind of like dig into. And so it's funny. The idea that like the next couple of years are the immediate goals is kind of wild to me. When we were working on startups, when we talk about immediate goals, we mean like the next 2 weeks. Like that's what an immediate goal is. But by the way, even at Iterative now, which we run kind of like a lot of our stuff, you can ask June and Pranav, we don't know what we're going to do 6 months from now. We're like kind of have visibility in the next 3 months. I don't know what we're doing 6 months from now. I don't know what we're doing 18 months from now, 3 years. I don't know. We don't know. And the reason why it's like this is because when you're working in kind of like startups and stuff, you're learning so fast and you get so many stuff wrong. Like for us to make a 5-year plan now would be ridiculous. Like, we're going to we would throw it out immediately in 3 months because we're going to learn something new that, we found out we were being stupid about something.
Is there a moment when a product market fit feels like a home run? I knew a colleague who worked at Student Loan Hero and said it was like a rocket ship.
Is there a moment when a product feels like a home run? I mean, yeah. I mean, okay. The story that I always hear, which to me, I'm kind of like, this is like There's no definition of product market fit, as I like to say, but this is how I know somebody has product market fit. They wake up one day and they look at their growth chart and they think there's a bug. They're like, there's no way we can have this many kind of like users. And then they're like trying to find the bug. And then they find out they don't have a bug. And they're like, oh my God, we really have this many users. So that's what I would kind of like, that's how I always kind of like think about it. Yeah, sometimes it feels like that. Like I've definitely worked on projects where like I like literally went through the code because I was like, we can't have this many users. It's impossible. Like, where did they come from? So yeah, definitely has it. What did they say when it was like a rocket ship? Was it just like, I don't know, they were like, there's tons of users, or like, how did they explain it?
I think they would explain it more like the demand outstripped the supply. They didn't do any much marketing. They were just trying to keep up demand pretty much every single day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely happens. Yeah.
When choosing investors, should I pick people who are like me or those with different skills? And how important are they to startups besides money?
They're not important, guys. Like picking investors based off skills is just hilarious to me because it's like, guys, most of the investors don't have skills that are going to be useful to you at all. Like, let's be very honest here, right? Like the primary reason why you have investors is so that they can give you money. So you pick investors who are going to give you money and kind of leave you alone. Some investors are definitely kind of more useful than others. I would like to think Iterative is kind of like more useful as investors because we've like started startups. But if an investor has never started a startup before, you can just basically assume they're going to be like not very useful. They might introduce you to people. They tend to have good networks, but like they're not going to have skills that are going to be transferable. And so I just wouldn't worry about this too much. The one thing that you want to steer clear of is investors who think they can help you a lot and then they are very active but they're actually useless, and those tend to be investors who are like emailing you all the time, like, give me an update, where are you now, okay, what are you doing, this, are you hired this person, fucking run as far as you possibly can. It's like they just kind of like get in the way, and we've actually worked with some of our companies to like buy out those investors. We've told some of our companies to like, hey, you have to go talk to this investor and being like, hey, I appreciate you're taking interest in my company, but you're being counterproductive. I'm going to send you an update every 3 months, like I do all the other investors. And like, you're going to have to kind of learn from there. And they're gonna be like, no, I need it every week. And be like, I'm sorry, I don't have time to write you a specific update every single week. I'm running the company. No. Right. And I think sometimes people think that investors like get to do whatever they want. It's just not true. It's not true. Like, even if I went to one of our companies and was like, send me an update every week, they don't have to. There's nothing in the like legal documents that says they have to do that. They don't have to do it. Right. And so, yeah, that's the thing you should stay away from. So don't worry about picking investors based off skills. Most of them probably don't have any skills that matter to you. They're mainly money. Stay away from ones that are like, want to talk to you all the time or worried about their money. Also stay away from angels who you don't think have very much money, because they will also freak out. Yeah. And call you all the time because they gave you half of their net worth. And you're like, dude, you should not give me half your net worth. Yeah.
When investing in a startup, how do you know if they've proven their idea, and do they need to show you proof? If so, what kind of proof?
There isn't, I don't know if they've proven their idea. There's no way to kind of prove an idea. If somebody could come to me and they're like, I've proven without a fact that this is $1 billion idea, my job would be so easy. I'd be like, all right, cool. I'm going to take every single dollar that I can possibly find and give it to you. Right. We obviously don't do that. And the reason why is because we never know for sure. And so the thing that you have to be able to do when we're investing in your company is you need to get either Brian and I to believe that your idea is an idea that we should invest in. That's all it is. And it's probabilistic, right? So I've invested in ideas where I'm like 90% chance this doesn't work. But in the 10% chance that it does work, it would kind of like be this huge game-changing thing. And so, I do kind of expected value calculations, and I'm like, yeah, I think this is kind of worth it. So there's no such thing as a proven idea. Do you need to show proof? Proof always helps. We always think about this as evidence. And so, again, if Pranav is trying to sell me kind of like, if I'm trying to sell Pranav space heaters in Singapore, Pranav is probably like, I don't really think people in Singapore want heaters. And so he's going to need evidence that that is the case. And if I can show him evidence that a lot of people are buying heaters in Singapore, then maybe Pranav, maybe that's convincing to Pranav. But maybe it's not. And so I think what ends up happening is I ask Pranav whether he believes me. Pranav says no. Then I show Pranav evidence, and then I'm like, "Do you believe me now?" And then he's like, "No." And then I don't get investment. And then I try to find more evidence, or I try to find somebody who does believe me, and that basically ends up being kind of like the game. But all the proof almost always is kind of like, can you get real world kind of like sales or signups or something? At least for us, at least at Iterative, we do not care about any stupid McKinsey report or nonsense bullshit, kind of like any reports. We don't care about any of that. So sometimes people try to present it and I just stop. I'm like, I don't care about it. I don't care about anything in this report. Like, have you tried to sell space heaters? Right. So, me trying it. If somebody came to me and was like, they spent a month trying to sell space heaters, that's more valuable than any McKinsey report that I'll ever look at. So, yeah, try to sell the thing.
Do you think the valuation of a company at an early stage is similar to the founder's personal valuation? Because at that stage, there is nothing but people.
I think what you mean by personal valuation is basically like, do I think this person is going to be able to do it? Not how much money this person kind of actually has. Because I read it originally as how much money this person actually has. And I'm like, okay, that can't be right. No, I don't think so. I mean, I think there is I think that's a large part of that. You're kind of betting on the person. But again, like, if like, I don't know, like if Elon Musk, okay, maybe Elon is a bad example. He gets in all kinds of troubles these days. Take some like really good kind of founder and they're like, hey, you know what? You should give me $10 million. I'm going to find aliens. I'm like, oh God, I mean, you're really good, but find aliens? Like, what are we talking about here? Right. So there's clearly kind of like a part of this where the idea has to matter. And it has to be an idea that's like somewhat believable and evidence and all of that kind of stuff. So yes, maybe the bulk is kind of in the how much we would kind of rate the founder, but the idea has to be something. And so I don't think, I'm sure this has happened before, but I think almost all investments that VCs make, nobody does blind investments. So it's very rare where somebody will be like, hey, Sukan, I'll write you a blank check. Any company you start, here's $1 million. That doesn't happen, right? But it would if people are primarily kind of just investing in kind of the person. So, maybe I'm not a good enough founder, but like, I still have to pitch. Like, I would still need to go and be like, hey, I'm Sukan, blah, blah, blah. Here's what I think we should do. Here's what it is and all that stuff. So, yeah, I think the valuation is a large, the person impacts the valuation of a company quite a lot. But the idea kind of like matters a lot too.